The world did not end on September 26, 1983. There was no blinding flash across the horizon, no sirens tearing through American cities, no mushroom clouds rising over continents, no sudden silence of human civilization. History recorded no catastrophe, no global war, no final chapter of the nuclear age. And yet, in a quiet command center deep inside the military infrastructure of the Soviet Union, a single decision stood between humanity and possible annihilation. That decision was not made by a president, a general, or a global leader standing before cameras. It was made by a relatively unknown officer, a trained engineer, a military analyst, and a man who trusted knowledge over protocol. For several terrifying minutes, the survival of millions of Americans, Europeans, and Soviet citizens rested on the judgment of one human mind confronting a machine that insisted the world was under attack. This is not a story of heroism in the traditional sense. There was no battlefield, no dramatic confrontation, no visible enemy. It is a story of information, uncertainty, and the terrifying responsibility of interpreting data when the consequences of error could destroy civilization itself. It is the story of how knowledge, discipline, and rational doubt saved the world. It is the story of the night nuclear war almost began and did not. To understand the magnitude of what happened, one must first understand the atmosphere of fear that defined the early 1980s. The world was living at the peak of the Cold War, a period defined by ideological confrontation, nuclear proliferation, and mutual distrust between the United States and the Soviet Union. The global balance of power rested on a doctrine known as mutually assured destruction. Both superpowers possessed enough nuclear weapons to eliminate each other many times over. The logic was brutal but simple. If one side launched an attack, the other would retaliate instantly, guaranteeing the destruction of both. Peace, paradoxically, depended on the certainty of total war. But this fragile balance required something even more dangerous than weapons. It required perfect information. Leaders needed to know immediately if the enemy had launched missiles. Any delay could mean defeat. Any false alarm could mean catastrophe. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, technological systems had been developed to detect incoming nuclear strikes within minutes. Satellites orbited the Earth, scanning for heat signatures from missile launches. Radar networks monitored distant horizons. Computers processed data at speeds no human could match. Yet these systems had a fundamental weakness. They could detect signals, but they could not understand reality. Interpretation still belonged to human beings, and human beings could make mistakes. The relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union in 1983 was especially tense. Earlier that month, Soviet forces had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it strayed into restricted airspace, killing 269 civilians, including an American congressman. The incident intensified global outrage and deepened suspicion between the superpowers. Military exercises, intelligence operations, and political rhetoric all contributed to an atmosphere in which leaders on both sides feared that war might come suddenly and without warning. The possibility of a surprise nuclear strike was not considered remote, it was considered plausible. Inside the Soviet military command structure, enormous pressure existed to detect any American attack instantly and respond without hesitation. Speed was everything. Caution was dangerous. Delay could mean destruction. This was the strategic environment in which a complex early warning system known as OCO, meaning eye, was developed. It relied on satellites positioned high above the Earth to identify the intense infrared radiation produced by launching intercontinental ballistic missiles. The system was designed to provide the Soviet leadership with immediate confirmation of an American first strike, allowing them to launch a retaliatory attack before their own forces could be destroyed. It was an automated guardian watching the planet constantly. But even the most sophisticated technology depends on assumptions about physics, environment, and predictable behavior. And when those assumptions fail, machines can produce terrifying errors. On the night of September 26, 1983, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was serving as the duty officer at the Serpukhov 15 bunker, a secret Soviet command center responsible for monitoring the satellite early warning system. Petrov was not merely a soldier trained to follow orders. He had been educated as an engineer and understood the technical structure of the detection system. He knew its design, its limitations, and its potential vulnerabilities. This knowledge would soon become the most important factor in human survival. Shortly after midnight, the silence of the command center was shattered by an alarm. The system reported that a missile had been launched from the United States. Red warning lights flashed across control panels. Computer screens displayed trajectories indicating that an American intercontinental ballistic missile was heading toward Soviet territory. Sirens echoed through the facility. Protocol required immediate evaluation and rapid communication with high command. Moments later, the system reported additional launches. 2 missiles, then 3, then 4, then 5. According to the computer analysis, a nuclear attack was underway. Inside the command center, tension rose instantly. Operators stared at their screens, awaiting confirmation from their supervising officer. The procedures were clear. The duty officer was required to report the warning up the chain of command, where Soviet leadership would decide whether to launch a retaliatory nuclear strike. The timeline for such a decision was measured in minutes. Petrov faced an unusually weighty choice. If the warning were real and he failed to report it immediately, the Soviet Union could lose its ability to respond, potentially allowing the United States to destroy its nuclear forces and military infrastructure. If the warning were false and he reported it as genuine, the Soviet Union might launch a retaliatory strike against the United States, triggering global nuclear war. There was no margin for error. There was no opportunity for certainty. There was only judgment. Petrov began analyzing the information before him with disciplined skepticism. The data suggested that only a small number of missiles had been launched. From a strategic perspective, this seemed unusual. A genuine American first strike would likely involve hundreds of missiles designed to overwhelm Soviet defenses and eliminate retaliatory capability. Why would the United States launch only a handful? The system, however, insisted the attack was real. The computer classification labeled the warning with the highest level of confidence. Protocol demanded obedience to the machine. But Petrov understood something fundamental about technological systems. Reliability is never absolute. Sensors can misinterpret signals. Algorithms can misclassify data. Complex systems can fail in unexpected ways. His training as an engineer encouraged doubt where others might have seen certainty. He also considered another critical factor. Ground-based radar installations had not yet confirmed the incoming missiles. If the attack were real, radar should soon detect the approaching warheads. Until then, the satellite data remained the only evidence. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness. Inside the command center, every second felt heavier than the last. Personnel watched Petrov, awaiting his decision. The responsibility did not belong to a committee. It belonged to him alone. He later described the psychological pressure as overwhelming. The procedures, the alarms, the expectation of immediate action, everything pushed him toward reporting the attack as genuine.
The system was designed to eliminate hesitation. Yet he hesitated. He questioned. He reasoned. Petrov concluded that the warning was likely a false alarm. He reported the incident to higher authorities as a system malfunction rather than a confirmed missile launch. For several minutes afterwards, the fate of the world remained uncertain. If he had been wrong, Soviet territory would soon be struck by nuclear warheads. There would be no time to respond. But no missiles arrived. The radar systems detected nothing. The skies remained silent. The attack had never occurred. Later investigation revealed the cause. The satellite system had misinterpreted reflections of sunlight on high-altitude clouds as the heat signatures of missile launches. A rare alignment of environmental conditions had produced data that appeared indistinguishable from an actual nuclear strike. A natural phenomenon had nearly triggered a man-made apocalypse. Petrov's decision prevented immediate escalation. His refusal to accept the machine's conclusion without critical analysis interrupted a chain of events that could have led to retaliatory strikes against the United States and a full-scale nuclear exchange. The significance of this moment is difficult to exaggerate. A different officer, one less technically informed, less skeptical, or more rigidly obedient, might have followed protocol without question. History might have taken a different path. Yet, at the time, almost no one knew what had happened. The Soviet military did not publicly celebrate Petrov's actions. Acknowledging the incident would have revealed weaknesses in their early warning systems. Instead, the event remained classified, buried within the secrecy of the Cold War. The man who may have prevented nuclear war returned quietly to ordinary life. But the implications of that night extend far beyond one decision or one individual. The event revealed a profound truth about modern civilization. Technological systems that promise security can also create unprecedented risk, and human judgment remains essential even in an age of automation. The incident also exposed the fragility of the nuclear balance that governed global politics. The world had come dangerously close to catastrophe, not because of deliberate aggression, but because of misinterpreted data and the pressure of automated response systems. It was a warning about the limits of certainty in a world governed by machines. To fully understand why Petrov's decision mattered so profoundly, it is necessary to examine the broader architecture of nuclear command systems, the psychological doctrine guiding superpower strategy, and the extraordinary pressures placed upon individuals tasked with interpreting signals that could determine the fate of humanity. The nuclear age had transformed warfare into an exercise in calculation, prediction, and rapid response. Political leaders and military planners relied on complex networks of sensors, communications infrastructure, and automated procedures designed to ensure retaliation under any circumstances. The logic was intended to prevent war by making it unwinnable. But this logic also created scenarios in which a single misinterpretation could trigger irreversible consequences. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union developed launch-on-warning policies. These strategies allowed nuclear weapons to be launched upon detection of an incoming attack before enemy warheads could strike. The policy reduced vulnerability, but increased the risk of accidental war. The warning time for intercontinental ballistic missiles was approximately 30 minutes. Within that brief window, detection systems needed to identify launches, confirm trajectories, communicate findings, and allow leadership to decide whether to retaliate. Human beings were expected to make decisions of civilization-ending importance under extreme time pressure. Petrov's experience represented the most dangerous aspect of this system, the dependence on fallible technology interpreted by fallible humans within rigid institutional frameworks. His refusal to blindly follow the machine demonstrated an extraordinary commitment to rational analysis. He understood that information is not equivalent to truth, that data requires interpretation, and that the absence of certainty demands caution. His decision reflected a philosophical stance as much as a technical one, a belief that knowledge includes awareness of uncertainty. This intellectual humility may have saved millions of lives. The broader consequences of nuclear war in 1983 would likely have been catastrophic beyond comprehension. Military analysts have estimated that a large-scale exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union could have killed tens of millions of people within hours. Secondary effects, including radiation, environmental collapse, and nuclear winter, might have threatened the survival of modern civilization. Major American cities such as New York City, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles would likely have been primary targets. Soviet urban centers would have faced similar destruction. Global economic and ecological systems would have collapsed. All of this hung in the balance during those silent minutes inside a Soviet bunker. The story of that night raises profound questions about authority, responsibility, and the role of individual judgment within massive technological systems. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that civilization sometimes depends not on grand strategies or political declarations, but on the quiet reasoning of individuals operating far from public view. It also invites reflection on the nature of knowledge itself. What does it mean to know something with certainty? How should individuals act when confronted with information that could be true but cannot be verified? What responsibility accompanies the power to interpret signals that affect millions of lives? These questions remain deeply relevant in an era increasingly shaped by automation, artificial intelligence, and complex decision-making systems. The legacy of Stanislav Petrov is therefore not merely historical, it is philosophical, technological, and profoundly human. His decision demonstrated that knowledge is not simply the accumulation of data, but the disciplined ability to question, interpret, and judge. And on one night in 1983, that ability may have preserved the future of humanity.
To understand the magnitude of Stanislav Petrov's judgment, one must look beyond the silent bunker where the decision was made and examine the vast machinery of fear that had shaped global politics for decades. The night of September 26, 1983, was not an isolated incident emerging from a stable world. It occurred during one of the most dangerous periods in modern history, when suspicion between nuclear superpowers had reached extraordinary intensity, and both sides believed conflict might be imminent. In the early 1980s, the geopolitical climate was defined by deep mistrust and aggressive posturing. The leadership of the Soviet Union viewed the West not simply as a rival, but as a potential existential threat. Soviet intelligence agencies had become convinced that the United States was preparing for a possible surprise nuclear strike designed to eliminate Soviet defensive capabilities before retaliation could occur. This fear was institutionalized in a massive intelligence effort known as Operation Ryan, an attempt to detect early signs of American nuclear preparations. Soviet agents across the world were instructed to monitor even the smallest indicators, unusual military movements, increased communications, or sudden changes in political behavior that might suggest an impending attack. The atmosphere of suspicion created a dangerous feedback loop. The more one side feared attack, the more aggressively it prepared, and the more threatening those preparations appeared to the other side. At the center of American leadership during this period was Ronald Reagan, whose administration adopted a firm stance against Soviet expansion and increased military spending significantly. His rhetoric emphasized moral opposition to Soviet communism, and in 1983 he described the Soviet Union as an evil empire, language that intensified ideological confrontation. From the Soviet perspective, such statements reinforced fears that the United States might seek decisive military dominance. Meanwhile, the Soviet state itself was governed by Yuri Andropov, a former head of the KGB who possessed deep suspicion toward Western intentions. His leadership reflected a worldview shaped by intelligence analysis, secrecy, and vigilance against perceived threats. Under his authority, the Soviet military maintained a posture of extreme readiness. Both nations possessed thousands of nuclear warheads deployed across land, sea, and air. Intercontinental ballistic missiles stood ready in hardened silos. Submarines carrying nuclear weapons patrolled the oceans. Strategic bombers remained prepared for rapid deployment. The world lived under a permanent condition of readiness for instantaneous destruction. Against this backdrop, the Soviet early warning system that Petrov monitored had been developed with enormous urgency. The system's purpose was simple but terrifying: detect an American attack quickly enough to allow retaliation before Soviet forces could be destroyed. The designers of the system faced a profound dilemma. If the system were too cautious, it might fail to detect a real attack in time. If it were too sensitive, it might generate false alarms. In an environment dominated by fear, sensitivity was prioritized. This design philosophy reflected a broader strategic logic. Within nuclear doctrine, failing to respond to an actual attack would be catastrophic. Responding to a false alarm, however, could also be catastrophic. Yet military planners believed the greater danger lay in hesitation. The result was a system that placed extraordinary responsibility on the human operator tasked with interpreting its warnings. Stanislav Petrov's background made him uniquely suited to this role, though he never sought such responsibility. Born in 1939 near Vladivostok, he grew up during a period marked by global war and post-war reconstruction. His father had been a military pilot, and the environment of discipline and service shaped his early life. Unlike many officers within the Soviet military hierarchy, Petrov pursued technical education rather than purely military training. He studied engineering and developed expertise in the complex technologies underlying missile detection systems. His work involved not simply operating equipment, but understanding how it functioned, how it could fail, and how environmental variables could influence its readings. This technical knowledge cultivated a mindset fundamentally different from blind obedience. Engineers are trained to question assumptions, identify sources of error, and recognize the limitations of systems. On the night of the alarm, this mindset proved decisive. Petrov later explained that he trusted his own analysis more than the automated system because he understood that the technology was still relatively new and had not been fully tested under all conditions. He knew that satellite sensors could misinterpret natural phenomena. This awareness did not eliminate fear, but it provided a framework for rational judgment. His reasoning process reflected structured analytical thinking. He evaluated the scale of the reported attack, the absence of radar confirmation, and the strategic improbability of a limited American first strike. He also considered the broader geopolitical context. Although tensions were high, he judged that no immediate escalation suggested imminent war. Each piece of information taken alone provided limited certainty. Together, they formed a pattern inconsistent with a genuine attack. Yet reaching this conclusion required extraordinary psychological strength. The environment around him encouraged conformity. The alarms, the flashing warnings, the expectation of immediate reporting all reinforced the authority of the system. To resist this pressure required confidence not only in technical knowledge, but in personal judgment. Psychologists studying decision-making under extreme stress have noted that individuals often rely heavily on procedural rules when confronted with overwhelming uncertainty. Rules reduce anxiety by providing clear guidance.
In military organizations, adherence to procedure is considered essential for discipline and coordination. Petrov's decision, therefore, represented a deviation from institutional expectations. He did not ignore the alarm. He analyzed it. He evaluated its plausibility. He chose to classify it as a false alarm based on available evidence. This distinction between disobedience and critical reasoning is central to understanding the significance of his action. In the minutes following his report, the Soviet command structure remained on high alert. Additional monitoring continued. Radar operators searched for confirmation. Communication channels remained open. The possibility of attack could not be dismissed until sufficient time had passed. The psychological tension during this period was almost unbearable. If Petrov had been mistaken, incoming nuclear warheads would soon detonate across Soviet territory. The consequences of his judgment would be irreversible. Time became the ultimate judge. When no missiles appeared on radar and no explosions occurred, relief gradually replaced fear. The crisis passed quietly, leaving behind no public announcement, no global recognition, and no celebration. The world continued as if nothing had happened. Yet within military circles, the implications were profound. Investigations into the incident revealed that the satellite system had misinterpreted sunlight reflected from high-altitude clouds. The angle of the sun relative to Earth and the satellite sensors created a rare optical effect that mimicked the thermal signature of missile launches. This was not a failure of malicious intent or human sabotage. It was a failure of assumptions, a reminder that even sophisticated technology operates within uncertain environments. The incident forced Soviet engineers to reconsider aspects of the detection system and implement improvements. It also highlighted the necessity of multiple verification methods, including ground-based radar confirmation before any launch decision. In effect, Petrov's skepticism influenced future procedures designed to reduce the risk of accidental war. Despite the importance of his action, Petrov did not receive immediate recognition. The Soviet military was reluctant to acknowledge errors in its defense systems, particularly during a period of intense rivalry with the United States. Publicly celebrating the incident would have revealed vulnerabilities and undermined confidence in Soviet technological capability. Instead, Petrov faced a complex response. Although he was not severely punished, he was reportedly criticized for incomplete documentation of the incident and eventually left military service. His experience illustrates a paradox common within large institutions. Individuals who prevent disasters by deviating from expectations may not always be rewarded because acknowledging their actions requires admitting systemic weakness. For years, the world remained unaware of how close it had come to potential nuclear conflict. Only after the dissolution of the Soviet Union did details of the incident become publicly known. Former Soviet officials revealed the event in the 1990s, allowing historians and analysts to reconstruct the circumstances of that night.
The revelation stunned the international community. The idea that global survival had depended on a single officer's judgment challenged prevailing assumptions about the stability of nuclear deterrence. Scholars began examining the incident as a case study in risk management, human judgment, and technological reliability. It became a powerful example of how complex systems can produce unexpected failures and how individual reasoning can interrupt catastrophic processes. Petrov himself lived modestly after leaving the military. He did not portray himself as a hero and often insisted that he had simply performed his duty by analyzing the situation carefully. His humility reflected a consistent theme in his life, a belief that rational thinking and professional responsibility were more important than personal recognition. In later years, international organizations acknowledged his role in preventing potential nuclear conflict. He received awards recognizing his contribution to global peace and was invited to speak about the importance of human judgment in technological systems. His story resonated deeply in a world increasingly dependent on automation. The implications of Petrov's decision extend beyond the specific historical context of the Cold War. They illuminate fundamental questions about the relationship between humans and machines. As technological systems grow more complex and autonomous, the challenge of interpreting their outputs becomes increasingly significant. Modern societies rely on automated systems to manage infrastructure, financial markets, transportation networks, and national defense. These systems process enormous quantities of data and often operate beyond the direct comprehension of individual users. Yet automation does not eliminate uncertainty. It transforms uncertainty into new forms. Petrov's experience demonstrates that human oversight remains essential precisely because machines can produce convincing but incorrect conclusions. His skepticism represented not distrust of technology, but an informed understanding of its limitations. This lesson has influenced fields ranging from aerospace engineering to artificial intelligence research. Designers increasingly recognize the importance of maintaining meaningful human control over critical systems, ensuring that automated processes can be questioned and verified. The broader historical significance of the 1983 incident also lies in its demonstration of the fragility of peace during the nuclear age. The stability of deterrence depends not only on weapons and strategies, but on accurate information and rational decision-making. When information is uncertain, the risk of catastrophic error increases dramatically. The Cold War produced several incidents involving false alarms or misinterpretations that could have escalated into conflict. Petrov's case stands out because of the clarity of the decision and the magnitude of the potential consequences. It reveals that the survival of civilization has sometimes depended on individual judgment hidden from public view. For American audiences, the implications are particularly profound. The decision made inside a Soviet command center protected not only Soviet citizens, but also millions of Americans who would have faced immediate danger in the event of nuclear retaliation. The interconnectedness of nuclear strategy meant that any large-scale exchange would have affected populations across the globe. Cities, infrastructure, and entire societies would have been transformed within hours. The absence of catastrophe is therefore not merely a historical footnote. It is the foundation upon which contemporary life rests. The world that followed, the technological revolutions, medical advances, economic growth, and cultural developments of the late 20th and early 21st centuries depended on the continuation of human civilization beyond that night. Petrov's decision preserved the possibility of that future. Understanding this reality invites reflection on the nature of heroism. Traditional narratives often celebrate visible acts of courage performed in dramatic circumstances. Petrov's action, by contrast, involved quiet reasoning, disciplined analysis, and the courage to question authority. It was an intellectual form of heroism, rooted in knowledge. This distinction aligns with a broader historical pattern in which scientific understanding and rational decision-making have repeatedly prevented disasters. From medical breakthroughs that halted epidemics to engineering innovations that ensured structural safety, knowledge has served as humanity's most powerful defense against existential threats. Petrov's story represents this principle in its most extreme form. His decision also highlights the importance of education and critical thinking within institutions responsible for managing dangerous technologies. The capacity to evaluate information independently, recognize uncertainty, and resist unjustified conclusions is essential for maintaining safety in complex systems. Such capacities cannot be automated entirely.
They require human judgment shaped by experience, training, and intellectual discipline. As the Cold War gradually moved towards its conclusion in the late 1980s, efforts to reduce nuclear tensions increased. Arms control agreements sought to limit the number of deployed weapons and improve communication between superpowers. These developments reflected recognition of the dangers inherent in the nuclear standoff. Yet the fundamental challenges revealed by the 1983 incident did not disappear. The risk of misinterpretation, technological failure, and rapid escalation remains a central concern in global security. The story of Stanislav Petrov therefore continues to serve as a warning. It reminds us that the systems designed to protect humanity can also create new forms of vulnerability. It underscores the necessity of skepticism in the face of apparent certainty, and it demonstrates that individual decisions can shape the course of history in ways that remain invisible for years. In reflecting on the events of September 26, 1983, one confronts a profound truth about the modern world. Civilization's survival does not depend solely on political power or military strength. It depends equally on the capacity of individuals to think clearly under pressure, to question assumptions, and to act responsibly when confronted with uncertainty. Knowledge, when applied with discipline and humility, becomes a force capable of preserving life on a planetary scale. Petrov's decision embodies this principle. His judgment did not merely prevent a technical error from escalating into disaster. It demonstrated that rational thought can overcome fear, that human insight can correct mechanical failure, and that the future of humanity can hinge on a single moment of clarity. The world continued because one man chose to think, and that choice continues to echo through history.
The meaning of that night becomes even clearer when placed within the broader history of nuclear near misses, moments when misunderstanding, technological failure, or human error nearly unleashed catastrophe. The nuclear age did not merely introduce powerful weapons, it created an entirely new category of risk in which the speed of destruction surpassed the speed of human comprehension. The most famous early confrontation had occurred 2 decades before Petrov's decision, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In October 1962, the discovery of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba brought the world to the brink of war. Political leaders engaged in intense negotiations, military forces prepared for combat, and nuclear weapons stood ready for launch. During that crisis, survival depended largely on diplomatic restraint and strategic calculation. But even then, hidden beneath public negotiations were smaller moments of individual judgment that prevented escalation. Submarine commanders choosing not to fire nuclear torpedoes, officers interpreting ambiguous signals cautiously, leaders resisting pressure for immediate action. The pattern is consistent throughout nuclear history. Catastrophe has often been avoided not solely through formal policy, but through the reasoning of individuals confronting uncertainty. By the 1980s, however, the technological environment had changed dramatically. Decision-making systems had become more automated, detection mechanisms more sensitive, and response timelines shorter. The margin for reflection had narrowed. Machines increasingly shaped the conditions under which humans made decisions. Petrov's experience represented the logical extreme of this transformation, a moment when automated certainty confronted human doubt. Military strategists later studied the psychological dimension of his decision in detail. They asked how an individual surrounded by institutional pressure and technological authority could resist the impulse to follow established procedures.
The answer appears rooted in a combination of factors: technical knowledge, intellectual independence, and a willingness to accept personal responsibility. Responsibility is a central theme in the history of nuclear command systems. These systems distribute authority across multiple levels, ensuring that no single individual can initiate war unilaterally. Yet they also depend on individuals at critical points to interpret information accurately. Petrov occupied one of those points. His role illustrates a paradox inherent in complex organizations. The system was designed to minimize human error through automation and strict procedures, yet the system ultimately relied on human judgment to correct its own mistakes. This tension between automation and human oversight remains one of the defining challenges of modern technological society. In the decades since 1983, scholars in fields such as systems engineering and risk analysis have examined the incident as a case study in what is known as high-reliability organization behavior, environments where failure would have catastrophic consequences and where individuals must maintain constant vigilance. Such organizations recognize that errors are inevitable in complex systems. Their survival depends not on eliminating error entirely, but on detecting and correcting it before it escalates. Petrov's decision exemplified this principle. He did not assume the system was flawless. He actively searched for reasons why its conclusion might be incorrect. This approach reflects a deeper philosophical insight. Knowledge is not certainty, but justified belief grounded in evidence and open to revision. The broader strategic consequences of his judgment can only be understood by considering what might have followed a different decision. Had the Soviet command structure received confirmation of an American attack, the pressure to retaliate would have been immense. Launch on warning doctrine required rapid response to preserve deterrence. Once nuclear missiles were launched in retaliation, the sequence of events would likely have become irreversible. Strategic planners on both sides had long prepared for such scenarios. Targets had been selected, trajectories calculated, and command procedures rehearsed. A full exchange of nuclear weapons would not merely destroy military facilities, it would target industrial centers, communication networks, and major population centers. The objective of strategic deterrence strategy was to eliminate the adversary's capacity to function as a society. Scientific models developed during the Cold War suggested that large-scale nuclear war could produce global climatic effects known as nuclear winter. Massive firestorms ignited by nuclear detonations would inject enormous quantities of smoke and dust into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and lowering global temperatures. Agricultural production could collapse, food shortages could spread worldwide, ecosystems could suffer irreversible damage. These projections remain the subject of scientific debate, but their implications were sufficiently alarming to influence strategic thinking. Nuclear war threatened not only immediate destruction, but long-term environmental consequences affecting all humanity. Petrov's decision therefore prevented not merely a military conflict, but a potential transformation of the planet's ecological and social systems. The magnitude of this possibility invites reflection on the scale of modern technological power. Never before in history had individual decisions possessed such global consequences. The concentration of destructive capacity to an unprecedented degree placed enormous responsibility in the hands of relatively small groups of decision-makers. This concentration of power created ethical challenges unlike any faced in earlier eras. How should individuals act when their decisions could affect the survival of entire populations? What standards of evidence justify actions with irreversible consequences? Petrov's response suggests one possible answer. When uncertainty is high and consequences are catastrophic, restraint becomes a rational choice. Restraint, in this context, was not weakness. It was disciplined analysis, guided by recognition of uncertainty. The incident also reveals the importance of redundancy within critical systems. Following the false alarm, Soviet authorities strengthened procedures requiring multiple independent confirmations before any launch decision. The event reinforced the necessity of cross-checking data from different sources, reducing reliance on a single detection mechanism. Such safeguards have since become standard in many fields, from aviation safety to medical practice. The principle is simple. No system should depend entirely on one source of information when the stakes are high. Petrov's experience contributed to the recognition of this principle within nuclear command structures. As the Cold War progressed towards its conclusion, relations between the superpowers gradually improved. Diplomatic initiatives sought to reduce nuclear arsenals and increase transparency. Agreements aimed to limit the risk of accidental conflict and enhance communication between military commands. These developments reflected a growing awareness of the dangers inherent in rapid response systems and automated detection technologies. The end of the Cold War did not eliminate nuclear weapons, but it reduced the intensity of confrontation that had characterized earlier decades. The dissolution of ideological rivalry created opportunities for cooperation and arms control. Yet the legacy of nuclear risk persists. Several nations continue to possess nuclear arsenals, and technological systems remain integral to their command structures. The fundamental challenge of interpreting uncertain information under extreme time pressure has not disappeared. Petrov's decision therefore remains relevant as a model of responsible judgment. In the years after the incident became public, his story attracted attention from historians, scientists, and policymakers around the world. He received international recognition, including awards honoring his contribution to global security. His life became the subject of documentaries and academic studies exploring the human dimension of nuclear deterrence. What distinguished these accounts was not the drama of the event alone, but the character of the decision itself. Petrov did not act out of defiance or personal ambition. He acted out of careful reasoning and professional responsibility. His modesty in later interviews reinforced this impression. He consistently emphasized that he had simply performed his duty as he understood it.
Evaluating information critically and avoiding premature conclusions. This perspective reflects a conception of heroism grounded in intellectual integrity. For audiences reflecting on the broader implications of his story, the lesson is both inspiring and sobering. It demonstrates the power of knowledge to prevent disaster, but it also reveals the fragility of systems upon which global survival depends. Modern civilization rests upon networks of technology and decision-making processes that must function reliably under extreme conditions. The maintenance of these systems requires not only technical expertise, but ethical judgment. Petrov's example suggests that the most important safeguard against catastrophe may be the capacity of individuals to think independently and responsibly. This insight has influenced contemporary discussions about artificial intelligence and automated decision-making. As machines increasingly perform tasks once reserved for human judgment, questions arise about the appropriate balance between automation and human oversight. The 1983 incident serves as a reminder that even highly advanced systems can produce unexpected results. Human interpretation remains essential precisely because machines lack contextual understanding and moral responsibility. The relationship between humans and technology is therefore not of replacement, but of partnership. Machines provide speed and precision.
humans provide judgment and meaning. Petrov's decision illustrated the necessity of this partnership at a moment when its absence might have led to catastrophe. The story also carries a deeply human dimension beyond strategic analysis. It is a story about the psychological burden of responsibility. For several minutes, one individual bore the weight of a decision affecting millions of lives. The emotional impact of such responsibility cannot be fully measured. Petrov later described the experience as intensely stressful, a moment when every second seemed suspended between possibility and disaster. The awareness of potential consequences did not paralyze him. It compelled careful reasoning. His ability to remain calm under such pressure reflects qualities cultivated through training, experience, and personal character. It also reflects a broader truth about human resilience, the capacity to maintain clarity of thought even in moments of extreme uncertainty. This capacity has shaped history repeatedly. Scientific discoveries, medical breakthroughs, and diplomatic achievements have often emerged from individuals who refuse to accept conventional assumptions without critical examination. Petrov's decision belongs to this tradition. The closing reflection on his story invites consideration of the world that followed the night of September 26, 1983. The decades since have witnessed remarkable transformations: the expansion of digital technology, advances in medicine, global communication networks, and scientific achievements that have improved the lives of billions. These developments were possible because human civilization continued uninterrupted. The absence of nuclear catastrophe allowed societies to evolve, innovate, and pursue progress. The stability required for such advancement depends on the preservation of peace. Peace, in this case, was preserved not by grand declarations or dramatic interventions, but by a moment of disciplined reasoning inside a quiet command center. The significance of that moment continues to resonate. It challenges assumptions about the nature of power and the sources of security. It suggests that knowledge, when combined with humility and responsibility, possesses transformative force. Stanislav Petrov did not seek to change history. He sought to understand the truth of a situation presented to him under extraordinary circumstances. In doing so, he demonstrated that the most powerful decisions are often those guided not by fear, but by careful thought. His story reminds us that civilization depends not only on institutions and technologies, but on the quality of human judgment within them. And on one night in 1983, when machines declared that the world was ending, one man chose to question the signal. Because he questioned it, the world endured.
In the years that followed the revelation of the incident, historians and security experts began to reconsider many assumptions about nuclear deterrence and global stability. For decades, strategic doctrine had presented nuclear peace as the result of rational systems, balanced power, and carefully designed procedures. The existence of massive arsenals, it was argued, ensured restraint through fear of mutual destruction. Yet the story of Stanislav Petrov suggested something far more fragile. The survival of humanity had depended not solely on strategy or policy, but on a single individual's capacity to recognize uncertainty and resist automatic response. The machinery of deterrence, for all its complexity and power, ultimately relied on human judgment to function safely. This realization forced a deeper examination of how societies manage technologies capable of irreversible harm. Political leaders, scientists, and military planners gradually acknowledged that technological reliability alone could never guarantee safety. Systems must be designed with the expectation of failure.
Procedures must allow for doubt. Individuals must be trained not only to follow instructions, but to understand the systems they operate. Petrov's decision became an enduring example of what scholars later described as human-in-the-loop responsibility, the principle that critical decisions involving catastrophic risk must remain subject to human interpretation and control. This principle has since influenced global discussions about automation, artificial intelligence, and decision-making technologies. As systems become increasingly capable of processing information at extraordinary speeds, the question of when to trust machines and when to question them grows more urgent. The lesson of September 1983 remains clear. Speed without understanding can be dangerous, and certainty without verification can be catastrophic. The life of Stanislav Petrov after his military service reflected none of the dramatic recognition that might be expected for someone associated with such a consequential moment in history. He lived modestly, largely removed from the global attention that later surrounded his decision. He did not seek fame, and he consistently minimized his role, describing his actions as the natural outcome of professional duty. His humility reveals something essential about the nature of his judgment. He did not act to become a hero. He acted to solve a problem, to interpret data accurately and avoid error. In later years, international organizations honored his contribution to global peace, recognizing that his decision had prevented a potential chain reaction that could have led to nuclear war. These honors were not simply gestures of gratitude. They represented an acknowledgement of a profound truth. The preservation of civilization sometimes depends on quiet acts of intellectual courage. Petrov's story also reshaped how many Americans and others around the world perceived the Cold War. For decades, the conflict had been portrayed primarily through ideological narratives that emphasized opposition and rivalry. Yet the events of that night revealed a different dimension, the shared vulnerability of all humanity in the nuclear age. Had the false alarm triggered retaliation, both the United States and the Soviet Union would have suffered devastation on an unprecedented scale. The destructive power of nuclear weapons transcended political boundaries, threatening entire populations regardless of ideology. Petrov's decision therefore protected not one nation, but the possibility of a future shared by all nations. This perspective highlights an often overlooked aspect of the nuclear era: the interdependence of adversaries. The same technologies that enabled confrontation also created shared risk. Survival required not only strength, but restraint, not only preparedness, but wisdom. The significance of this realization extends beyond historical analysis. It offers insight into the ethical responsibilities associated with modern technological power. As humanity continues to develop increasingly powerful tools, from advanced computing systems to emerging scientific capabilities, the need for responsible judgment becomes ever more critical. Petrov's example suggests that knowledge must be accompanied by humility. Understanding the limits of certainty is as important as possessing technical expertise. His decision also raises enduring philosophical questions about the nature of truth and perception. The satellite system had produced data that appeared convincing, even authoritative. It represented reality through measurements and algorithms, yet reality itself differed from the system's interpretation. This distinction between data and truth lies at the heart of modern knowledge systems. Information does not interpret itself. Meaning arises through human analysis. Petrov recognized this distinction at a moment when failure to do so might have ended human history. The intellectual discipline required to question apparent certainty reflects a tradition extending back through centuries of scientific inquiry. From the earliest observations of natural phenomena to the development of modern experimental methods, progress has depended on skepticism, the willingness to test assumptions and revise conclusions. Petrov's judgment embodied this tradition under extraordinary circumstances. His story, therefore, belongs not only to military history, but to the broader history of human knowledge. It demonstrates that the principles of critical thinking, evidence-based reasoning, and intellectual responsibility are not abstract ideals. They possess tangible consequences for the survival of societies. The emotional dimension of his decision invites reflection on the psychological burden carried by individuals entrusted with great responsibility. In the silent minutes following the alarm, Petrov confronted uncertainty at a scale few humans have ever experienced. The weight of potential consequences could have produced paralysis or blind obedience. Instead, he maintained clarity of thought. This capacity for reason under pressure represents one of humanity's most remarkable traits. It is the same capacity that enables surgeons to operate during emergencies, pilots to manage failing aircraft, and scientists to analyze unexpected results. In each case, knowledge provides the foundation for action. The closing decades of the 20th century, shaped by the avoidance of nuclear catastrophe, allowed humanity to pursue extraordinary achievements. Medical advances extended life expectancy. Global communication networks connected distant societies. Scientific exploration expanded understanding of the universe. These developments were not inevitable. They depended on the continuation of human civilization. The world that exists today, its cities, institutions, and cultures, rests on countless decisions made in moments of uncertainty. Among these decisions, the choice made by Stanislav Petrov on September 26, 1983, stands as one of the most consequential. It preserved the possibility of progress. It preserved the continuity of human experience. It preserved the fragile conditions under which knowledge itself can grow. Reflecting on this reality encourages a deeper appreciation of the forces that shape history. Power is often associated with visible authority, political leadership, military strength, economic influence. Yet the story of Petrov reveals another form of power, the power of understanding. Knowledge, when applied with discipline and integrity, can alter the course of events more profoundly than weapons or commands. This insight carries implications for future generations. The preservation of civilization depends not only on technological advancement, but on the cultivation of critical thinking, ethical responsibility, and intellectual humility. Education, scientific inquiry, and open examination of evidence become essential safeguards against catastrophic error. The legacy of Stanislav Petrov, therefore, extends beyond the Cold War. It speaks to the enduring challenge of managing knowledge responsibly in an age of unprecedented technological capability. His decision reminds humanity that the greatest dangers often arise not from deliberate
hostility, but from misunderstanding, misinterpretation, and unchecked certainty. Preventing such dangers requires individuals capable of questioning assumptions and seeking truth, even under intense pressure. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the memory of that night in 1983 continued to serve as a quiet warning. It revealed how close the world had come to irreversible destruction, not through war, but through error. And it revealed how fragile the boundary between catastrophe and survival. Stanislav Petrov died in 2017, leaving behind a legacy defined not by public acclaim, but by the preservation of human possibility. His life illustrates a profound paradox. One of the most important decisions in history was made in secrecy by a man whose name remained unknown to the most of the world for decades. Yet the consequences of his judgment are visible everywhere, in the continued existence of societies, the flourishing of cultures, and the lives of billions who inherited a world not consumed by nuclear fire. His story endures because it captures an essential truth about the human condition. Civilization is sustained not only by grand institutions and powerful technologies, but by the capacity of individuals to think clearly, act responsibly, and recognize the limits of certainty. On a quiet night during the most dangerous period of the nuclear age, machines declared that the end had begun. Data signaled destruction. Protocol demanded response. Fear urged immediate action. But one man chose knowledge over panic. He chose analysis over assumption. He chose responsibility over obedience. And because of that choice, the world did not end. The sky remained silent. The cities of the earth awakened the next morning, as they always had, unaware that their future had depended on a single moment of human judgment. The story of Stanislav Petrov is therefore not merely a historical account. It is a reflection on the power of knowledge, the necessity of doubt, and the fragile miracle of human survival. It reminds us that history is shaped not only by the events that occur, but by the disasters that are prevented. And sometimes the greatest victory in human history is the catastrophe that never happened.